For years, elite private schools have claimed to reward hard work and excellence. But what happens when a student with perfect grades, leadership, and talent is rejected without reason? When Shaquille O'Neal's daughter is told she's not the right fit, he uncovers a hidden system designed to keep certain doors closed, no matter how qualified you are. As the truth unravels, the fight for justice becomes bigger than one student. It becomes a battle against privilege, power, and the silent rules no one dares to challenge. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The sun poured golden light through the large glass windows of the O'Neal residence, casting long, warm shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and crisp bacon filled the air as Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, but just dad at home, sat at the kitchen island, flipping through his phone while casually munching on a protein-packed breakfast. Across the table, Shawnee Henderson stirred a spoonful of honey into her tea, glancing up occasionally to watch their daughter, Mayara, practically bounce with excitement. At 15, Mayara was already tall, poised, and brimming with ambition. She had inherited Shaq's towering presence, but carried herself with a quiet confidence that was entirely her own. "Today's the big day," Shawnee remarked, setting her mug down with a soft clink. "Are you ready?" "Mom, I was born ready." Mayara grinned, spreading avocado on her toast. "I've been prepping for this interview for weeks. I know their curriculum, their history, their mission statement, everything." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "That's my girl, always prepared." He leaned back in his chair, his deep voice warm with pride. "Remember, success isn't just about talent. It's about taking advantage of the opportunities in front of you." Mayara nodded. She had heard these words before. Her father's journey from a young, determined athlete to one of the most recognizable sports figures in history was a story she knew by heart. But this wasn't about basketball. This was about proving she belonged in the elite academic world of Brentwood Academy, one of Los Angeles' most prestigious private schools. Shawnee, however, had reservations. She sipped her tea slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Just be prepared for anything," she said carefully. "Schools like Brentwood, they have a history. They say they want diversity, but sometimes they still favor certain families over others. Connections matter more than they should." Shaq's expression darkened slightly. "If they're about excellence, they'll see she's the best candidate, period." Mayara rolled her eyes. "Mom, Dad, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not worried. I'll impress them. What could go wrong?" Her confidence was unshakable. But as the morning wore on, an unsettling feeling hung in the air, one that no one in the O'Neal household could quite place. The city moved in a rhythm of its own. Cars zipped through the wide streets, palm trees swayed lazily under the California sun, and the world outside Mayara's car window looked as bright as her future. Shawnee drove while Mayara sat beside her, reviewing her notes one last time. "Remember to make eye contact," Shawnee reminded. "Be articulate, but not rehearsed. You want them to see the real you." "Mom, I got this," Mayara assured her, setting her tablet aside. They turned onto the pristine driveway of Brentwood Academy. The campus was immaculate, red brick buildings framed by ivy, perfectly manicured lawns, and students walking with an air of privilege, the kind of privilege that was inherited, not earned. Shawnee parked the car and turned to her daughter. "No matter what happens in there, you're already exceptional." Mayara smiled and squeezed her mother's hand before stepping out. Inside the main building, the air smelled of polished wood and old money. A receptionist with a tight bun and an even tighter smile gestured toward the waiting area. "The admissions board will see you shortly." Mayara sat, her back straight, her mind sharp. She had this in the bag, until she saw who else was waiting. A boy, about her age, with neatly combed blonde hair and a self-assured smirk. He was flipping through a brochure absent-mindedly, as if he already knew he belonged. Mayara recognized him immediately, James Whitmore III. His father was a major donor, and his grandfather's name was engraved on one of the campus buildings. James glanced at her, then gave a knowing smile. "Didn't know they were expanding the diversity quota this year." he remarked casually. Mayara's stomach tightened, but she refused to flinch. Didn't know legacy admissions were still a thing, she shot back. Before James could reply, the receptionist called her name. It was time. The room was grand yet intimidating. 3 board members sat behind an antique oak table, their expressions unreadable. The head of admissions, a tall woman with sharp eyes, gestured for Mayara to take a seat. Miss O'Neill, welcome. Tell us, why Brentwood Academy? Mayara took a steady breath. Because Brentwood represents excellence, I believe in challenging myself, in growing through competition. I don't want to just be great, I want to be the best, and I know Brentwood can help me get there. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, raised an eyebrow. Impressive answer. Your academic record is outstanding, and your extracurricular involvement is notable. But tell me, what do you believe sets you apart from other applicants? Mayara smiled. I don't just want to be here because of my last name. I want to be here because I earned it. A murmur of approval passed between the board members. The interview continued. Questions about leadership, ethics, and aspirations. Mayara handled each one with poise. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, until the final question. Miss O'Neill, how do you handle adversity? Mayara's response was instant. I face it head on. I don't run from challenges. I rise to them. The head of admissions nodded. That's good to hear. Because at Brentwood, adversity can take many forms. It's not always fair. It's not always easy. But the students who succeed here don't just meet expectations, they exceed them. There was something about the way she said it that felt pointed, as if this was more than just a standard question. Mayara left the room feeling confident, but something lingered in the back of her mind. A nagging feeling that the real challenge hadn't even begun yet. Days passed. Then a week. Mayara checked the mailbox every afternoon, her excitement slowly shifting into impatience. Finally one evening, Shawnee called out from the door. Mayara, it's here. Mayara's heart pounded as she tore open the envelope. She scanned the words quickly, her breath catching at one particular line. We regret to inform you. Silence. Shaq, standing nearby, frowned. What? No way. That doesn't make sense. Mayara stared at the letter, the words blurring. I don't get it. I did everything right. Shawnee's lips pressed together. I told you, sweetheart, some doors don't open because they weren't meant to. They open because someone paid for the key. Shaq's jaw clenched. We'll appeal. We'll... Mayara shook her head, her mind racing. This wasn't just a rejection. It was something bigger, something calculated. And she wasn't going to let it go. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rejection wasn't just a disappointment. It was a warning. And Shaq was ready to find out exactly who was behind it. Shaq drove through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, the city lights flickering through his windshield as his mind raced. Something about Mayara's rejection didn't sit right with him. He had spent his entire life believing that hard work and talent were the only things that mattered. But this situation gnawed at him in a way he couldn't ignore. Westbridge Academy hadn't just rejected his daughter, they had dismissed her without a second thought. There was no explanation, no feedback, just a cold, impersonal letter that left more questions than answers. He parked outside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, a discreet meeting place chosen for privacy. Inside, Jordan West was already waiting for him, nursing a drink in the back corner. Jordan had always been the guy who knew things before anyone else did. His legal career had placed him in circles where powerful people spoke freely, assuming their words would never leave the room. But Jordan wasn't just a bystander. He had seen firsthand how elite institutions operated behind closed doors. Sliding into the booth, Shaq wasted no time. He told Jordan everything, the interview, the rejection, the unqualified students who had been accepted instead. Jordan listened carefully, nodding along, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. Shaq's eyes narrowed as he scanned the screen. An email chain between 2 Westbridge admissions officers. At first glance, it seemed routine. Brief, professional, the kind of message exchanged hundreds of times during the admissions process. But one line made his blood run cold. Mayara O'Neill, Strong candidate, but not the right fit for Westbridge's culture. Dr. Calloway agrees. Proceed with alternate selections. Shaq read the words again, then again. His chest tightened. Not the right fit. What did that mean? Miara had every qualification they could possibly ask for. Academic excellence, leadership, community service. But none of that mattered. The decision had been made before she even set foot in that interview room. Jordan watched him carefully, gauging his reaction. He had seen these patterns before, knew exactly what was happening. Westbridge, like so many other elite institutions, carefully curated its student body. Diversity was accepted in small, controlled doses, just enough to maintain the illusion of inclusivity. But too much change, too much deviation from their carefully crafted image, was quietly shut down behind closed doors. Shaq felt a slow, simmering anger settle in his chest. He had played by the rules, trusted that his daughter would be judged by her abilities alone. But now, he saw it for what it was. A game where the rules only applied to some. By the time he left the bar, the email had been forwarded to his phone. He drove home in silence, gripping the wheel tightly. At the house, Shawnee was waiting. She had been restless all evening, checking her phone every few minutes hoping for an update. The moment Shaq stepped inside, she could tell from his expression that he had found something. He handed her the phone, and she read the email quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. The words hit hard. She had spent years navigating these spaces, understanding the subtle, coded ways exclusion worked. This wasn't new. It was just more personal this time. Miara had done everything right. She had worked hard, excelled in every way possible. And yet, here they were, reading an email that dismissed her as if she were an afterthought. Shawnee exhaled sharply, setting the phone down. She had heard the stories before. Brilliant students passed over for legacy admissions. Well-qualified candidates quietly discarded in favor of names that carried weight. She had seen it in corporate spaces, in social circles, in institutions that claimed to be meritocratic but operated by unwritten rules designed to keep certain people out. Shaq sat down heavily at the table, his hands clasped together. The rejection had stung before, but now it felt like something more, a deliberate choice, a silent message. Jordan's final words echoed in his mind. You're not the first. This had been happening for years. Miara wasn't just another rejection. She was part of a pattern. And Dr. Calloway, the man who had so calmly dismissed his daughter's potential, was at the center of it. Shaq wasn't one to jump to conclusions without proof, but this was different. The email was enough to confirm his suspicions, but not enough to hold anyone accountable. He needed more. Real evidence. Something undeniable. Shawnee seemed to be thinking the same thing. She sat down across from him, eyes sharp, mind already working. They couldn't just let this go. They had to find out how deep this ran, how many others had been quietly turned away with vague, meaningless rejections. She reached for her laptop, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. There had to be other cases, students who had the credentials but not the connections, parents who had questioned these decisions but never had the proof to fight back. Shaq leaned back, watching her work. He had spent his life overcoming obstacles, proving doubters wrong, breaking through barriers. But this was something different. This was a system that didn't care how hard you worked, how good you were. Westbridge Academy had underestimated him. They had made a mistake, and he was about to prove it. Shaq arrived at Westbridge Academy just as the morning sun cast long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawn. The school's prestigious reputation was reflected in every inch of the property. The towering brick buildings, the neatly trimmed hedges, the students in crisp uniforms walking between classes with an air of confidence that came from knowing they belonged. But not everyone was given that privilege. He stepped out of his SUV, his towering frame making heads turn. Parents dropping off their children did a double take. A few recognized him, offering polite smiles, but Shaq barely acknowledged them. He wasn't here to make an appearance. He was here for answers. Inside, the administrative office was just as polished as the rest of the campus. A receptionist at the front desk looked up, blinking in surprise at the sight of him. She quickly composed herself, her voice polite but hesitant. "Mr. O'Neill, do you have an appointment?" I need to see Dr. Calloway. His tone was calm, but firm. The receptionist hesitated before picking up the phone. After a hushed conversation, she nodded toward the hallway. You can go in. Shaq walked toward the principal's office, his footsteps heavy against the polished floor. He wasn't nervous. He had faced tougher opponents on the court, in boardrooms, in life. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This was about his daughter. Dr. Richard Calloway sat behind a massive oak desk, hands folded neatly as Shaq entered. He was an older man, impeccably dressed, with the measured confidence of someone used to being in control. A slight smile flickered across his lips as he gestured to the chair across from him. Mr. O'Neill, he said smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Shaq didn't sit. I want to talk about my daughter's rejection. Calloway leaned back slightly, tilting his head. Ah, yes. Miara O'Neill. A fine young woman. Then why wasn't she accepted? The principal exhaled softly, as if this was an uncomfortable but routine conversation. As I'm sure you know, Westbridge Academy is extremely selective. We receive thousands of applications for a limited number of spots. Unfortunately, we simply cannot accommodate every qualified student. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He opened the email Jordan had sent him and placed the device on Calloway's desk. The principal's gaze flickered to the screen, his expression unreadable. This says my daughter wasn't the right fit for Westbridge's culture, Shaq said, his voice controlled but firm. You want to explain what that means? Calloway didn't flinch. He picked up the phone, skimming the email as if it were an insignificant detail. Then he set it down, folding his hands once more. I understand your frustration, he said evenly. But this is being taken out of context. Out of context? Shaq's jaw tightened. Then put it in context for me. Calloway sighed, choosing his words carefully. Westbridge has a unique environment. We cultivate a certain academic and social atmosphere, one that aligns with our long-standing traditions. Shaq stared at him, waiting. Calloway met his gaze, his tone carefully neutral. Not every student thrives in that environment. We consider multiple factors beyond just academics and extracurriculars. The implication was clear. Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the desk. He had expected deflection, but hearing it aloud still sent a slow burn through his chest. My daughter is smart. She's hardworking. She's everything this school claims to stand for. His voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it. So tell me, Dr. Calloway, what exactly about her didn't fit? Calloway's lips pressed together in a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. O'Neill, I assure you, this decision was made based on a holistic review of all applicants. I can't discuss individual cases beyond that. Shaq took a slow breath. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. So let me get this straight, he said. You're telling me my daughter, a student with perfect grades, leadership experience, and a strong interview, just happened to not fit into your school's culture, while other students with weaker applications somehow did? Calloway's gaze remained steady, but there was something in his posture that shifted ever so slightly. Admissions decisions are complex. There are many elements at play. Shaq studied him for a long moment. He could see it now, the way Calloway carefully danced around his words, never saying anything outright, but making his meaning clear. This wasn't about Miara's qualifications. It never had been. He exhaled sharply, pushing off the desk and straightening to his full height. I appreciate your time, Doctor. Calloway. Calloway nodded smoothly. I wish Miara the best in her future endeavors. Shaq turned and walked out of the office, his mind already racing. He had walked into that meeting looking for a confession, a slip-up, something that would force Calloway to admit the truth. Instead, he had been met with carefully controlled responses, the kind designed to keep people like him quiet. But Shaq wasn't just anyone. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air filling his lungs, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting this go. Westbridge thought it could get away with quietly shutting its doors on kids like Miara. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The morning was unusually quiet in the O'Neill household. Shaq sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. his fingers hovering over the contact list. His conversation with Dr. Calloway still echoed in his mind, the carefully chosen words, the dismissive tone, the way the principal had acted as if Mayara rejection was just another routine decision. But Shaq knew better. He had spent his life fighting battles on the court, but this one was different. This wasn't about competition. It was about justice. He had worked too hard, built too much, to let this slide. If they thought he would just accept this and move on, they didn't know him at all. His thumb finally pressed call on a name he had been considering all night. Devin Brooks. Devin was a seasoned journalist, known for his fearless investigations into racial discrimination in elite institutions. He wasn't the type to run a fluff piece or get distracted by celebrity status. He dug deep, unearthed uncomfortable truths, and forced people to look at the things they preferred to ignore. If anyone could bring this story to light, it was him. The phone rang twice before Devin picked up. "I was wondering when you'd call." His voice was calm, measured. He had heard the rumors, seen the whispers online about Mayara's rejection. This wasn't a surprise to him. Shaq leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice steady. "I've got something for you." "Tell me." Shaq didn't hold back. He explained everything. The rejection, the email, the vague reasoning about Mayara not being the right fit. He laid out the history of Westbridge's admissions process, how certain families always seemed to get their kids in, regardless of qualifications. By the time he finished, Devin was silent for a moment, absorbing it all. "This isn't just about Mayara, is it?" Devin finally said. "No," Shaq admitted. "It's about every kid who ever got shut out without knowing why." Devin exhaled, already making notes. "Send me the email. Let me do some digging." Shaq forwarded it immediately. The moment the message was sent, he knew there was no turning back. 2 days later, the headline broke. Westbridge Academy's Admission Secrets: The Truth Behind the Rejection Letters. The article was thorough, filled with carefully verified facts, anonymous sources, and a timeline of Westbridge's questionable admission patterns. Devin had uncovered other families with eerily similar stories. High-achieving students denied entry, while legacy applicants with lower scores were welcomed with open arms. Some parents, afraid of backlash, spoke anonymously. Others, emboldened by Shaq's stance, came forward publicly, sharing rejection letters that echoed the same vague language Mayara had received. The story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage, former students and faculty chiming in with their own experiences. Some recounted how they had always suspected bias, but never had the proof to say it out loud. Others demanded an investigation into the school's practices. Westbridge Academy's official response came swiftly, a polished statement from Dr. Calloway appeared on the school's website, denying all allegations of discrimination. The statement insisted that Westbridge upheld the highest standards of fairness and diversity, calling the accusations misguided and unsubstantiated. Shaq read the statement twice, his jaw tightening. He had expected denial, but the wording was careful, designed to shift the narrative. The school wasn't just defending itself, it was painting him as the problem. The backlash had only just begun. Over the next few days, national media outlets picked up the story. Some sided with Shaq and the other families, calling for an internal review of Westbridge's admission process. Others twisted the narrative, implying that Shaq was using his celebrity status to pressure the school into giving his daughter special treatment. He expected criticism. He knew how these things worked. But it was different seeing his name dragged into a debate that missed the entire point. Mayara, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She refused to talk to reporters, refused to check social media, but Shaq could tell the situation weighed on her. She was used to attention, but not like this. Not as the face of a controversy she never asked for. Shawnee kept an eye on their daughter, while Shaq worked behind the scenes. He wasn't just relying on public pressure. He was gathering more evidence. Through Jordan's contacts, more emails surfaced. Communications between the admissions team discussing how they selected students to maintain the culture of the school. The language was deliberately vague but undeniably patterned, a carefully orchestrated effort to ensure that only certain kinds of students were welcomed into Westbridge's elite circle. Shaq didn't release the emails immediately. He had learned long ago that timing mattered. The next move came when a former Westbridge faculty member stepped forward. Olivia Carter, a former admissions officer who had worked at the school 5 years ago, broke her silence in an exclusive interview. She revealed how the admissions process was designed to favor legacy students while subtly pushing out others through vague rejection language. "I saw students like Mayara get rejected every year," she admitted on live television. "I was told it wasn't about race, but when you looked at the numbers, it was impossible to ignore the pattern." Her words sent shockwaves through the debate. For the first time, the school was losing control of the narrative. Dr. Calloway tried to remain composed, but pressure mounted. Alumni started speaking out. Parents of current students began questioning how Westbridge had been making decisions for years. Donors, the people who truly held power in the school, began distancing themselves, worried about their own reputations. Shaq watched it all unfold with quiet determination. They weren't at the finish line yet, but for the first time, Westbridge was on the defensive, and he was just getting started. The Westbridge Academy boardroom was filled with an unusual tension. The long mahogany table, usually a place of quiet authority, now carried the weight of a scandal that refused to die down. Board members sat stiffly in their high-backed chairs, their expressions carefully neutral, as Dr. Richard Calloway cleared his throat. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Outside the pristine walls of the academy, the media storm raged on. The article exposing the school's discriminatory practices had spiraled into a full-blown crisis. Donors were asking questions, concerned parents were demanding answers, and a whistleblower had just emerged, adding more fuel to the fire. Dr. Calloway adjusted his tie, choosing his words carefully as he addressed the board. "This institution has upheld the highest standards of excellence for decades. We cannot allow baseless accusations to tarnish our legacy." A few board members nodded, but others shifted uncomfortably. The evidence was mounting, and their financial backers were growing restless. Westbridge had always operated in a world of quiet privilege, where problems were handled discreetly. This time, however, the situation had spiraled out of their control. The meeting stretched into tense deliberations, but one message was clear. They needed to contain the damage, and they needed to do it fast. Meanwhile, Shaq sat in a sleek minimalist law office in downtown Los Angeles. Across from him, Lionel Carter, a renowned civil rights attorney, leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced as he studied the situation. "This isn't just about your daughter anymore," Lionel said, his voice even. "You're looking at systemic discrimination hidden behind polished words and selective traditions." Shaq nodded. "I want to take action, but I don't want this to turn into a personal battle. This is bigger than Mayara." Lionel tapped a folder on his desk. "A legal case could force Westbridge to open their records. If we can prove a pattern of exclusion, they'll have no choice but to answer for it." Shaq exhaled slowly. He had considered this route, but now it felt real. Lawsuits weren't just about winning. They were long, exhausting, and often manipulated by those with deeper pockets. Westbridge would fight back, using its wealth and influence to paint itself as the victim. "Before we go public with this," Lionel continued, "we need stronger evidence, something irrefutable." Shaq met his gaze. "What do you have so far?" Lionel pulled out a confidential statement, a testimony from a former Westbridge admissions officer, given under anonymity. The pages detailed how the school operated with unofficial quotas, ensuring that a certain percentage of students were from preferred backgrounds. The wording was always carefully coded, but the intent was clear. Westbridge had a system in place to keep diversity controlled. Shaq clenched his jaw as he read. It wasn't about qualifications. It was never about qualifications. Inside the walls of Westbridge, the boardroom discussions had turned into heated debates. The wealthiest donors, families with deep-rooted connections to the school, were demanding that the situation be buried before it caused irreversible damage. One board member, visibly unsettled, finally spoke. "We cannot ignore the fact that a national spotlight is now on us. If we don't address this, it won't just be Shaquille O'Neal coming after us. The Department of Education, civil rights organizations, the media, they will all start digging." Dr. Calloway remained composed, but the cracks in his confidence were beginning to show. "The worst thing we can do is give in to public pressure. If we make any admissions, we open ourselves up to legal scrutiny." The donors, however, were less interested in legal consequences and more concerned about preserving their influence. A longtime benefactor leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. "We fund this institution because we trust you to uphold its standards. If this escalates further, some of us may reconsider our financial support." Calloway understood the threat beneath those words. The board wasn't just worried about reputation, they were worried about power. And in their world, power was built on access and exclusivity. Shaq knew the school would try to protect itself at all costs, but he didn't expect the warning that came next. Late that night, Jordan West called him. His voice was tense, laced with urgency. "Shaq, listen to me. They're preparing to spin this against you." Shaq sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" Jordan hesitated before continuing. "The board is being pressured to turn this into a celebrity entitlement issue. They're going to push the narrative that you're using your fame to bully the school into admitting Mayara." Shaq closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. It was a classic move. Flip the script. Make the accuser look like the aggressor. Jordan wasn't done. "And that's not all. They're trying to suppress the new evidence. I heard from a source that Calloway is reaching out to the whistleblower, probably offering a deal to make them disappear." Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. He had expected resistance, but now Westbridge was playing dirty. "They think they can control the narrative," Jordan continued. "They've done it before, but they've never gone up against someone like you." Shaq knew this was the moment that defined the fight. He could either let the school's machine bury the truth, or he could go all in and expose them before they had the chance to rewrite the story. He had made his decision. The pressure inside and outside Westbridge was now at a breaking point. Parents were speaking up. More reporters were digging into the school's history, and the board was scrambling to regain control. Dr. Calloway had spent years cultivating an image of Westbridge as an institution of integrity, but now his leadership was being openly questioned. Shaq, however, was already planning his next move. He wasn't just going to fight this battle in the press, he was about to take it to court. And this time, Westbridge wouldn't be able to silence the truth. The backlash against Westbridge Academy should have pushed them into retreat, but instead, they came back swinging. The school's PR machine moved swiftly, releasing carefully crafted statements that shifted the focus away from discrimination and onto Shaq himself. News headlines started appearing across media outlets. "Shaquille O'Neal demands special treatment for daughter at elite academy." "Entitlement or fairness? The debate over celebrity influence in private schools." "Should fame grant privilege? Westbridge stands by its admissions process." The narrative had been flipped. Shaq was no longer a father fighting for justice. He was being painted as an entitled celebrity, trying to strong-arm an institution into bending its rules. Television panels filled with analysts who debated whether Shaq was overreacting. Social media exploded with divided opinions. Some defended him, pointing out the pattern of discrimination at elite schools, while others questioned if he was using his platform unfairly. Westbridge's strategy was clear: turn the fight into a debate about celebrity privilege rather than systemic bias. If they could convince the public that Shaq was the aggressor, they could weaken the growing movement against them. But Shaq wasn't about to let them control the story. A well-known network reached out, offering Shaq a chance to appear on a televised debate against a Westbridge representative. His team was cautious. They knew the risks. One wrong move, and he'd play right into the school's hands. Still, Shaq agreed. If Westbridge wanted a public fight, he was ready. The debate aired live, with millions watching. Shaq sat across from Elliot Grayson, a high-ranking Westbridge official who had the smooth confidence of a man trained to dodge uncomfortable truths. The moderator opened the discussion. "Mr. O'Neal, let's address the central claim here. Some believe you are using your status to pressure Westbridge Academy into admitting your daughter. How do you respond?" Shaq kept his expression calm. "This was never about special treatment, it's about fair treatment. My daughter had the qualifications, the talent, and the dedication. But she was rejected with no explanation, while less qualified students from elite families were accepted. That's not fairness. That's privilege." Grayson smiled politely, as if dealing with an impatient child. "Westbridge Academy follows a holistic admissions process. We consider many factors beyond just grades and extracurriculars. Sometimes, even very talented students don't get in. Shaq leaned forward slightly. So tell me, what was missing from Miara's application? Grayson didn't blink. As I said, we consider many factors. Shaq cut him off. I've seen the emails. The ones where your admissions team said my daughter wasn't the right fit for Westbridge's culture. What does that mean, Mr. Grayson? The question hit its mark. For the first time, Grayson hesitated. The audience noticed. The moderator noticed. The tension in the room shifted. Still, Grayson recovered quickly. That email is being taken out of context. We simply meant that every student needs to be the right match for the school's environment. Shaq didn't back down. And what about the former students who were also rejected under similar circumstances? Students from backgrounds like mine, who didn't have the right name or connections? How many of them weren't the right fit either? Grayson's smile faltered just slightly. He hadn't expected Shaq to turn the debate into a pattern of exclusion rather than a personal case. The moderator jumped in, sensing the shift. Mr. Grayson, is Westbridge willing to conduct an independent review of its admissions process to address these concerns? Grayson's response was smooth but empty. Westbridge stands by its integrity. We welcome diversity and fairness, and we will continue to uphold our high standards. It wasn't an answer. It was an escape. The debate ended, but Westbridge hadn't won anything. If anything, their vague responses had only raised more suspicion. And then came the unexpected twist. Hours after the debate aired, a woman named Olivia Carter came forward. She was a former Westbridge applicant, someone who had been silenced years ago after being rejected in a nearly identical situation. Her message, posted across social media, went viral instantly. When I was 16, I applied to Westbridge Academy. I had a 4.0 GPA, leadership experience, and glowing recommendations. But I was rejected without reason. Years later, I found out why. A former staff member told my parents that certain families don't get into Westbridge, no matter how qualified they are. I stayed silent because I thought I was alone. But I'm not alone anymore. Shaq, I stand with you. Within minutes, her story was being shared worldwide. Westbridge had fought back hard, but now they had a new problem. A witness who wasn't just speaking up, but proving that this issue went beyond Miara. For the first time since the scandal began, Westbridge was losing control, and Shaq was just getting started. The auditorium at Westbridge Academy had never felt this crowded before. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras rolling, their lenses fixed on the long wooden table at the front of the stage. Rows of chairs were filled with parents, faculty members, and students, all waiting for the moment that had been building for weeks. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with expectation. At the center of it all sat Dr. Richard Calloway. His normally composed demeanor was cracked, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him. His suit, usually pristine, seemed a little less crisp today. His fingers tapped anxiously against the table as he waited for the cameras to settle, his jaw tightening when he caught sight of Shaquille O'Neal standing near the entrance with Miara by his side. Shaq stood tall, his presence commanding without a single word. Miara, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, held her head high. She had been forced to carry the burden of this fight. But today, she wasn't just a symbol of injustice. She was the reason the system was being forced to change. Dr. Calloway cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone in front of him. The murmurs in the room faded into silence as he looked down at the prepared statement in his hands. His fingers tightened around the paper before he finally exhaled and began speaking. At Westbridge Academy, we have always prided ourselves on upholding the highest standards of academic excellence and integrity. His voice was steady, rehearsed, but the audience wasn't here for a school mission statement. He hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the cameras before he continued. However, in recent weeks, concerns have been raised about our admissions process. These concerns have been serious, and as an institution, we have taken the time to reflect. A pause. A carefully calculated breath. We recognize that our admissions process has, at times, failed to be as transparent and inclusive as it should be. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, the first crack in the wall. Dr. Calloway pressed forward, each word feeling like it was pulled from him against his will. After a full internal review, and in light of recent evidence, we acknowledge that our process has not always been as equitable as we intended. Specifically, We regret the rejection of certain students who were fully qualified and deserving of admission, including Miss Miara O'Neill. Shaq remained expressionless, but Miara's lips parted slightly in surprise. It was the first time her name had been spoken in an official statement. They could no longer ignore her. Dr. Calloway's grip on the podium tightened. To Miss O'Neill, and to any student who has ever felt unseen or unfairly denied an opportunity at Westbridge, we offer our sincere apologies. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Shaq exhaled slowly. They finally said it. Dr. Calloway continued, his voice less confident than before. Effective immediately, Westbridge Academy will be revising its admissions policies to ensure that all applicants are evaluated fairly, without bias, and with full transparency. The room stirred again, this time with a mixture of approval and skepticism. Words were one thing, action was another. The school board chair, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, took over. These changes will include an independent review committee to oversee admissions, the elimination of legacy-based preferences, and the implementation of a structured appeals process for students who believe they have been unfairly denied. Shaq nodded slightly, not fully satisfied, but knowing this was a step in the right direction. Dr. Calloway's voice wavered slightly as he delivered his final statement. Westbridge Academy is committed to learning from its mistakes and ensuring that every student, regardless of background, has a fair opportunity to be a part of our institution. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment that Westbridge finally took accountability. As the press conference ended, Shaq and Mayara made their way outside, the cool air hitting them as soon as they stepped beyond the grand entrance of the academy. Reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras shoved toward them, voices overlapping with rapid-fire questions. Mr. O'Neill, are you satisfied with the school's apology? Miara, how do you feel hearing your name acknowledged publicly? What do you think about the changes they're implementing? Shaq raised a hand, signaling for calm. The crowd quieted just enough for his deep voice to cut through. This was never about just one student. It was about every student who has ever been turned away without a fair shot. Today is a step in the right direction, but a policy change means nothing unless it's enforced. We'll be watching. We'll be making sure these promises aren't just words. Miara took a slow breath before finally speaking for herself. For a long time, I felt like I wasn't good enough, like I had done everything right. But it still wasn't enough. She glanced back at the school, then turned her gaze forward again. But now I know it was never about me. And if this fight helped even one student out there believe that they deserve to be seen, then it was worth it. The crowd erupted with more questions, but Shaq and Mayara didn't stay to answer them. They had said what needed to be said. As they walked toward the car, Mayara looked up at her father. We won, right? Shaq was quiet for a moment, then smiled softly. We made them listen. That's a win in my book. That night, the press conference dominated the news cycle. Clips of Dr. Calloway's shaky apology were replayed over and over, analyzed by commentators, dissected by experts. Some called it too little, too late. Others saw it as a major victory in the fight against institutional bias. But one thing was clear. Westbridge would never be able to operate in the shadows again. Shaq sat in his study, scrolling through messages from friends, supporters, and even strangers who had followed the story. Shawnee sat across from him, watching him with quiet pride. Mayara walked in, holding her phone. Dad, look at this. She handed him the screen. It was a message from a young girl in Detroit, a high school student who had been rejected from a similar elite academy. I was about to give up, but because of you, I believe I can be anything. Shaq stared at the words for a long moment. His throat tightened. This wasn't just about a school anymore. This was about changing the game for every kid who had been told no for reasons that had nothing to do with talent or ability. He looked at his daughter, his voice thick with emotion. You know what, Mayara? She smiled knowingly. We didn't just win. We changed something. And for the first time since this fight began, it truly felt like a new beginning. This version keeps the emotions raw and impactful, capturing the weight of the apology while showing that the fight for change is never truly over. Let me know if you need any refinements. The news came on a quiet afternoon, delivered in an email that was nothing like the rejection letters Miara had grown so familiar with. The subject line read, "Your application has been accepted, Westfield Preparatory School." Shaq and Miara sat together on the couch, their eyes scanning the message. Shawnee stood nearby, watching as the excitement slowly began to register. Westfield Preparatory was one of the most prestigious schools in the country, an institution that valued diversity and opportunity as much as it did academic excellence. Unlike Westbridge, Westfield didn't operate on old traditions or selective favoritism. It valued the kind of students who could challenge the status quo. Miara was one of those students. As Shaq finished reading the email, he couldn't help but let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You did it, baby girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Miara smiled, the weight of everything she had fought for, everything they had fought for, lifting from her shoulders. She was finally going to a place where her talents, her determination, her potential mattered. It wasn't just about getting in anymore. It was about being valued for who she truly was. She hugged her father tightly, and for the first time in a long while, Shaq felt the full force of what they had accomplished. "This isn't just my win, Dad," Miara whispered. "It's ours." And in that moment, Shaq knew. This wasn't just about a school or a victory. It was about changing the narrative for every kid who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. The journey didn't end with Miara's acceptance. Shaq had spent countless hours in meetings, discussions, and planning sessions. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. He had seen firsthand how the system worked, how doors were closed, how certain students were denied opportunities, not because they weren't capable, but because of who they were, because of their race, their background, their family's lack of connections. That was something Shaq could no longer ignore. It was time to make a real change, not just for his family, but for every family who had ever been left out in the cold by an unjust system. With the backing of his supporters, some of the same parents who had come forward in the aftermath of the Westbridge scandal, Shaq launched the O'Neill Initiative, a nationwide program designed to provide underprivileged students with the resources they needed to break through the barriers of systemic discrimination in education. The initiative would focus on scholarships, mentorships, and legal support for families fighting for fair access to education. It was built on the principles of fairness, opportunity, and equal representation. "Education is the key to everything," Shaq said during the initiative's launch event, "and every child, regardless of where they come from, deserves to have that key in their hands." The initiative gained traction quickly, and soon Shaq was traveling across the country, visiting schools, meeting with community leaders, and giving speeches about the need for change. He wasn't just advocating for his daughter anymore. He was advocating for an entire generation of kids who deserved the same opportunities. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting with a group of philanthropists in New York, Shaq found himself in a community center in South Los Angeles. It was a modest building, tucked away in a neighborhood that didn't always get the attention it deserved. But Shaq knew the people there mattered, and so did the kids. He had been invited to speak at a youth event, an opportunity to meet some of the kids who would benefit from the very initiative he had launched. As he walked through the doors, he was greeted by the energy of dozens of young faces, full of curiosity and anticipation. Shaq smiled as a group of children surrounded him, some shy, others bold, all eager to meet the man who had started this movement. The walls were lined with artwork, each piece reflecting the dreams of children who were beginning to believe those dreams could be realized. Shaq made his way to the front, where a group of children had gathered to welcome him. A young girl, no older than 11 or 12, stepped forward hesitantly, holding a piece of paper in her hand. "Mr. O'Neill," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing. I never thought I'd have a chance to go to college, but now I believe I can." Shaq knelt down to meet her gaze, his heart swelling. He had heard stories like hers before, but hearing it from this child, this bright-eyed young girl who was full of potential, made everything he had done feel worth it. "What's your name, sweetie?" he asked gently. "Amina," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "Amina Williams." "Amina," Shaq repeated her name, smiling. "You can be anything you want to be. Never forget that." Amina looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes, her voice cracking slightly as she whispered, "Because of you, I believe I can be anything." Shaq's chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The room seemed to blur around him. All the fights, all the struggles, all the obstacles. It had been worth it for moments like this. For kids like Amina, who now had a chance at something they'd never believed possible before. He smiled through the lump in his throat, reaching out to gently squeeze Amina's hand. "Keep believing, Amina. And I'll be right here, rooting for you every step of the way." As the event continued, Shaq walked through the center, shaking hands, speaking to parents, meeting more kids who had their own dreams. But his thoughts kept returning to that moment with Amina. This wasn't just about a fight for one school. This was about fighting for the future. A future where every child, regardless of where they came from, had a chance to succeed. And in that moment, Shaq realized something profound. He had won more than just a battle. He had changed lives. He had given kids like Amina something they had never been given before: hope. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The fight for equal opportunity isn't over. For every student like Mayara, there are countless others facing silent discrimination in education. Want to be part of the change? Support policies that promote fair admissions, mentor students from underrepresented backgrounds, and demand transparency in elite institutions. Follow our mission, share this story, and help us break the cycle, one student at a time. Join the movement. The future depends on it.